It was early October when I decided to head to a secluded cabin in the woods for a quiet weekend. I'd rented the place online, a small wooden cabin nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from the noise and chaos of the city. I was 32 and had been craving some solitude for months. The cabin looked perfect in the pictures. Simple, rustic, and surrounded by nothing but towering trees and rugged terrain. The drive out there took me nearly 6 hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it looked cozy. It was made of weathered logs with a steep, shingled roof. A small front porch with 2 rocking chairs faced the gravel driveway. There was no cell service, which was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect anyway. As I unpacked my things, the silence felt almost deafening. No cars, no voices, just the occasional chirp of crickets and rustling leaves in the breeze. The air smelled earthy, a mix of pine and damp soil. I told myself it was exactly what I needed. A break from the city, a chance to recharge. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. There was a small kitchen with outdated appliances, a stone fireplace in the living area, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. It felt cozy but slightly worn, like it hadn't seen much use in years. I checked the windows and doors to make sure everything locked properly and settled in for the night. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the curtains. I spent most of the day exploring the woods around the cabin. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and gnarled. The trails were faint, barely visible beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. It felt peaceful, almost too quiet. As the afternoon stretched on, I stumbled across something odd, a campsite. It was old, with a collapsed tent and a fire pit filled with ash. There were remnants of trash scattered around, rusted cans and a few torn pieces of fabric. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. Still, it gave me an uneasy feeling. I quickly moved on, heading back toward the cabin. That evening, as I sat on the porch with a beer in hand, I noticed the woods felt different. The birds had gone quiet, and the usual rustling of leaves had stopped. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, I was alone in a remote cabin. It was natural to feel a little on edge. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching sound, like someone walking on dry leaves. I froze in bed, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought and crept to the front door. Peering out the window, I didn't see anything. The driveway was empty, and the trees loomed silently in the darkness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I locked the door again and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying the sound, imagining all the things it could have been. By the time I drifted off, the first light of dawn was creeping into the sky. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't feel like exploring after the strange noise the night before. I spent the morning chopping wood and cleaning up the porch, trying to keep busy. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a subtle sensation, like eyes boring into the back of my head. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. The woods seemed normal, but they felt off, like the air was charged with tension. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't mine. I'd been wearing hiking boots, and these were bare, like someone had been walking around barefoot. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere with no shoes? I tried to tell myself it could have been from days ago, maybe even weeks. But deep down, I knew they were fresh. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fireplace, a heavy flashlight in my lap, listening for any sound outside. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the crunching of leaves, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the back of the cabin this time. I turned off the lights and crept to the window. Peeking out, I saw nothing but darkness. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to see, but I knew it wasn't an animal. I stayed up the rest of the night, my heart racing. The next morning, I found more footprints, this time circling the cabin. They were barefoot just like before, and they seemed to lead off into the woods. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't going to stick around to see who or what was out there. As I loaded my car, I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. I couldn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Just as I was about to get into the car, I noticed something on the porch. It was a small wooden carving, roughly shaped like a human figure. I hadn't seen it before. My stomach churned. Had someone been on the porch while I was sleeping? I didn't waste any more time. I got in the car and started driving, not caring about the speed limit or the winding mountain roads. A few hours later, I reached a small gas station and stopped to fill up. As I stood by the pump, I glanced back at my car and froze. There, on the rear bumper, was another wooden carving, identical to the one I'd found on the porch. I don't know how it got there. I didn't stop to find out. I drove straight home, the sense of dread following me every mile of the way. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Sometimes, when I look out the window at night, I think I see a shadow in the distance, standing perfectly still, just watching. I was 26 when I decided to move out of the city for a while. I was burnt out, working endless hours at a tech startup in New York, and I thought I needed a break from the constant noise and chaos. A friend of mine mentioned a small, quiet town in upstate New York, close to the Adirondack Mountains. He told me the town was cheap, peaceful, and surrounded by nature. It sounded perfect, so I found a rental cabin just outside town and decided to stay for 3 months. The cabin was a small, one-story structure with a faded green roof and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow gravel road winding up to it. The air was crisp, the nights were quiet, and for the first few weeks, I felt like I had made the right choice. I spent my mornings hiking the nearby trails and my afternoons reading or sketching. The forest was beautiful and thick, with towering pines and oaks that seemed to stretch forever. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, and the crunch of my boots on the dirt paths. But there was one thing that stood out: a quarry about 2 miles from the cabin. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I'd seen, and I only stumbled upon it by accident. I was following a faint trail one afternoon when I came to a clearing. The ground dropped off suddenly into a wide, shallow pit filled with gray rocks and overgrown weeds. The quarry felt off. The air was colder there, and the silence was deeper, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just an abandoned quarry, probably used decades ago and forgotten. Still, I didn't stay long. Something about it made my skin crawl. Over the next few weeks, I tried to avoid the quarry, but no matter which trails I took, I always seemed to end up near it. The faint paths crisscrossed in confusing ways, and even when I thought I was walking in the opposite direction, I'd come around a bend and find myself staring at the gray rocks and weeds again. One day, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the edge of the quarry. They were fresh, and they didn't look like hiking boots. They were bare feet, and the toes were spread wide like someone had been walking with wet, muddy feet. I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't make sense. The quarry was miles from any houses, and the gravel road to my cabin didn't show any signs of cars passing through. Who would be wandering barefoot in the middle of the woods? I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear, though the tracks didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. But after that, I started noticing other things. At night, I'd hear faint rustling outside the cabin. Sometimes it sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. One evening, I walked outside with a flashlight to investigate. The air was cold, and the forest was pitch black beyond the reach of the beam. I circled the cabin but found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found scratches on the side of the cabin. They were shallow but long, like something had dragged its claws along the wood. The marks were about chest height, too high for most animals. I decided to set up a trail camera. I attached it to a tree near the cabin and angled it to cover the clearing in front. If something or someone was coming around at night, I wanted to know. That night, I locked all the doors and windows and sat by the fire with a book. The hours passed slowly, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep in the chair. The next morning, I retrieved the camera and checked the footage. Most of it was uneventful, just shifting shadows and the occasional squirrel. But around 2:30 a.m., the camera caught something. A figure stepped into the clearing. It was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. The camera's infrared lens made everything appear in shades of gray, but I could see enough to know it wasn't an animal. The figure stood motionless for a long time, facing the cabin. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I felt sick to my stomach. It wasn't just the figure itself that unsettled me. It was the way it moved. Its movements were stiff, almost jerky, like it wasn't used to walking. I decided to leave. Whatever was going on in those woods, I didn't want to be part of it. I packed my things and called the cabin's owner, letting them know I was cutting my stay short. But when I got into my car and started driving down the gravel road, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. It didn't move, even as I sped up and drove away. I didn't stop until I was back in the city. I never found out what that figure was, and I didn't go back to the cabin to find out. Months later, I looked up the area online, trying to see if anyone else had reported anything strange. I found a few mentions of the quarry, but nothing concrete. One forum post stood out, though. Someone mentioned that the quarry had been used for mining in the early 1900s, but there were rumors of people disappearing in the area, even back then. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes I dream about the quarry. In my dreams, I'm standing at the edge, staring down into the gray rocks, and every time I feel like something is staring back. It was October of 2018 when I decided to rent a remote cabin in northern Minnesota for a week. I needed a break from everything: work, the city, people. I was 31 then, living in Minneapolis, and the constant rush of urban life had been grinding me down. The cabin was cheap, tucked deep in the woods, and had no internet. That's exactly what I wanted: silence and space to breathe. The drive up there took about 6 hours. I followed narrow roads that snaked through miles of dense forest, the kind where trees press close on both sides, forming a canopy that blocks out the sun. By the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low. The gravel driveway was overgrown, with weeds and shrubs brushing the sides of my car. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures online. Small, with weathered wooden walls, a steep roof, and a porch that sagged slightly under its own weight. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was clean and functional. There was a wood stove for heat, a tiny kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom that thankfully had running water. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched out endlessly. There wasn't another soul for miles, and the nearest town was a good 30-minute drive. Felt isolating, but that's what I wanted. I spent the first day settling in, unpacking groceries, and chopping wood for the stove. The woods around the cabin were eerily quiet. Occasionally, I'd hear the rustle of leaves or the call of a distant bird, but it was nothing like the constant hum of the city. As night fell, the darkness swallowed everything. I lit a few lanterns and settled in with a book, enjoying the solitude. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking the trails near the cabin, cooking simple meals and reading. Felt good to disconnect, to let my mind wander. But by the third night, I started feeling uneasy. It began as a faint sensation, like I was being watched. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. Of course, there was never anyone there. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. It was faint, just a soft crunch of leaves, but it was enough to jolt me awake. I lay there in bed, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too purposeful. They stopped near the front porch, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, the porch creaked, as if someone had stepped onto it. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Gripping the flashlight I kept by the bed, I forced myself to get up. I didn't turn on any lights, not wanting to alert whoever, or whatever, was outside. I crept to the window and peered out. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was a wall of black. I stayed there for what felt like hours, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself to go back to bed, though I barely slept. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were human, barefoot, and elongated, as if the person's feet had been stretched unnaturally long. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who would be wandering barefoot out here in the middle of nowhere? I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I went for a long hike, hoping the exercise would clear my head, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. That night, I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. I even dragged a chair in front of the door just in case, but it didn't help. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of tapping on the bedroom window. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers on the glass. My stomach dropped. The bedroom window was on the second floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity, then stopped abruptly. I waited, straining to hear any other sounds, but the night was silent. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found scratches on the window frame, long and deep, as if someone or something had been clawing at it. The unease I'd been feeling all week turned into full-blown dread. I wanted to leave, but something about the cabin or the forest seemed to hold me there. It's hard to explain, but it was like a weight pressing down on me, keeping me from packing up and driving away. That night was the worst. I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat in the living room, clutching a hunting knife I'd found in one of the kitchen drawers. The lantern on the table cast flickering shadows on the walls. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. They circled the cabin, pausing every now and then. I gripped the knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat. Then, the footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, frozen, listening. A few minutes later, I heard the back door creak open. I don't know how I managed to move, but I did. I bolted up the stairs to the bedroom and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the lock. For hours, I sat in the corner of the room, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it never did. When dawn finally broke, I summoned every ounce of courage I had and ventured downstairs. The back door was wide open, swinging gently in the morning breeze. There were more footprints in the dirt outside, leading into the woods. I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I grabbed my things, threw them into the car, and sped down the driveway, not caring about the branches scratching the sides of the car. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened at that cabin. I've thought about it a lot, tried to rationalize it, but nothing makes sense. I'll never go back there. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear those footsteps circling the cabin in my mind. It wasn't just the footsteps or the scratches that haunt me. It's the figure I saw just as I was driving away. A tall, skinny silhouette standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. It wasn't human. I'm sure of that. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And I hope I never see it again. I was 32 when I moved to the outskirts of Pine Hollow in Oregon. It was late 2022, and I had finally saved enough money to purchase a small 2-bedroom house nestled between dense woods and a long gravel road. It wasn't luxurious, but it was quiet, just what I needed after a messy divorce and years of living in the chaos of Portland. The property was isolated. There were no close neighbors, and cell service was spotty at best. To me, that was part of the appeal. It was a chance to unplug and start fresh. I spent the first few weeks settling in, getting used to the creaks of the old house and the constant rustling of the forest outside. One weekend in early November, I decided to take a hike into the woods behind my house. The previous owner had mentioned an old trail leading to a small clearing where they used to camp. They had left behind a hand-drawn map in a drawer, marking the path and noting landmarks like a large boulder and a fallen tree. Seemed simple enough, and I was eager to explore. I packed a small backpack with water, a snack, and a flashlight just in case. I wasn't planning on staying out long, but I liked to be prepared. The trail was easy to follow at first. It was well-trodden, with patches of fallen leaves crunching under my boots. The air was cool, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting golden beams on the ground. I felt at ease, enjoying the solitude and the earthy scent of the forest. After about an hour, I reached the large boulder marked on the map. It was massive, covered in moss, and oddly shaped, almost like a giant's fist rising out of the ground. I paused there to take a sip of water and check my progress. According to the map, the clearing was only another 20 minutes ahead. As I continued, the trail became less defined. The dirt path thinned, and the trees grew closer together. I had to duck under low-hanging branches and step over tangled roots. I started to notice how quiet it was. The usual chirping of birds and rustling of small animals had faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. I told myself it was just the time of day or the season. Animals probably moved elsewhere as the colder months approached. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I pressed on, determined to reach the clearing. The map showed the path veering slightly left, but when I looked around, there wasn't a clear direction anymore. I spotted what looked like a faint trail heading left and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead me to the right spot. The farther I went, the stranger the forest felt. The trees here were older, their gnarled roots twisting out of the ground like claws. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth was almost overpowering. I noticed things that didn't belong. An old, rusted can wedged between roots, a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch, and what looked like a broken hunting knife stuck in the dirt. I tried to shake off my unease. People had probably wandered this way before, leaving things behind. But why would someone leave a perfectly good knife? I checked my watch. It was almost 3 p.m., and I didn't want to lose daylight. I decided to turn back. The clearing could wait for another day when I had more time to explore. That's when I realized I had no idea which way I had come. I spun around, looking for familiar markers, but everything looked the same. The trees, the ground, the scattered leaves. It was like the forest had swallowed the trail. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out my flashlight and map, trying to make sense of where I was. The map was useless without a clear trail, and the flashlight barely cut through the thick shadows under the trees. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping it would lead me back to the boulder. I walked for what felt like hours, but the forest seemed endless. The light was fading, and the shadows grew longer. My boots crunched over dry leaves and snapped twigs, the sound too loud in the silence. That's when I saw it, a small wooden structure in the distance. It looked like an old hunting cabin, half hidden behind a thicket of trees. Relief washed over me. If someone was there, they could help me find my way back. As I approached, I realized the cabin was abandoned. The wood was rotting, and the roof had partially caved in. Still, it was shelter. I decided to rest there and figure out my next move. Inside, the air was musty, and the floor was littered with debris. Broken glass, old newspapers, and what looked like animal droppings. There was a small cot in the corner, its mattress torn and stained. I sat on the edge of the cot, pulling out my water bottle and taking a long drink. My stomach growled, but I wasn't hungry anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. That's when I noticed the scratches on the walls. They were deep and jagged, like someone or something had clawed at the wood. Some of the marks formed strange symbols, almost like runes. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Suddenly, a noise outside made me freeze. It was faint, like the crunch of leaves underfoot. My mind raced. Was it an animal? Another person? I turned off my flashlight, plunging the cabin into darkness. My heart pounded as I waited, straining to hear anything else. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The noise stopped, and the silence was deafening. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. Eventually, I forced myself to look outside. The forest was dark, and the trees cast long, menacing shadows. I didn't see anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided to leave the cabin and try to find my way back, even if it meant wandering in the dark. Staying there felt worse than being lost. As I stepped outside, I saw something glinting on the ground. A small, silver key. It didn't belong there. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I grabbed the key and stuffed it in my pocket, then started walking as fast as I could. Every sound felt amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the sound of my own breathing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. Hours passed, and I still couldn't find the trail. Exhaustion set in, and my legs ached with every step. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw a faint glow through the trees. It was my house. I stumbled onto the gravel road, tears of relief streaming down my face. I didn't stop until I was inside, locking the door behind me. I never went back into those woods, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint noises outside, like footsteps crunching over gravel. And when I look out the window, I swear I see a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching. It never moves. It just waits. And I never leave my house after dark anymore. It was early October of 2018, and I was 28 years old. My job was wearing me thin, and I desperately needed a break. I'd always been the outdoorsy type, and camping was my escape from the daily grind. So, I packed up my gear, loaded it into my old SUV, and drove 3 hours out to a remote forest in Pennsylvania. I had no particular campsite in mind, just a rough idea of where I wanted to pitch my tent, a secluded area far from the crowded public spots. The air was crisp and cool as I arrived late in the afternoon. Leaves painted in oranges, reds, and yellows blanketed the forest floor, crunching softly underfoot as I scouted for the perfect spot. After about 20 minutes of walking deeper into the woods, I found a small clearing near a creek. The sound of the water was calming, and the isolation was exactly what I was looking for. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and got a fire going. By the time night fell, I had a modest meal cooking over the flames, just some canned chili I'd brought along. It was a quiet night, the kind where you can hear every rustle, every snap of a twig, every distant hoot of an owl. As the fire crackled, I leaned back in my camp chair and stared at the sky. The stars were scattered across the darkness, brighter than I'd seen in a long time. It reminded me why I loved camping so much. Out here, everything felt simpler, quieter. Around 10 p.m., the chill in the air grew sharper. I stoked the fire, adding another log, and decided to call it a night. Crawling into my tent, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and closed my eyes, listening to the soothing flow of the creek nearby. But then, something woke me. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling outside. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound persisted. It wasn't the random scurrying of a squirrel or the slow crunch of a deer moving through the brush. It was deliberate, slow, heavy. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound circled my tent, stopping every few seconds before resuming. My heart started to pound, but I forced myself to stay still. I wasn't about to unzip the tent and investigate. Instead, I reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag, a small but sharp blade meant for utility more than protection. Minutes passed. The sound faded, and I began to relax, telling myself it had been a curious raccoon or something equally harmless. But just as I started to drift back to sleep, there was a noise that froze me completely, a low, guttural grunt, followed by a high-pitched, almost human-like whine. I sat up, clutching the knife tightly. My eyes darted to the shadows cast on the tent walls by the fire outside. One of them didn't look right. It was taller, thinner, and the way it moved wasn't natural. It didn't bob or sway like a person or animal. It shifted almost mechanically, like a puppet on strings. Then it stopped. I heard the sound of breathing. Not my own. This was heavier, raspier, like whatever was out there was struggling to inhale. The shadow loomed closer, and I could see the vague outline of legs, long and jointed in a way that didn't make sense. And then it spoke. Not words, not really, but sounds that mimicked speech, like someone who had never spoken trying to imitate the cadence of human language. I froze, my brain scrambling for an explanation. Person? No, the shape was wrong. An animal? No animal I knew made sounds like that. The shadow shifted again, retreating slightly. I took the opportunity to grab my flashlight, flicking it on and shining it at the tent wall. The shadow disappeared instantly, as if it had never been there. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any sign of movement. But whatever had been outside didn't return. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped out cautiously, knife in hand. The fire had burned out, leaving only smoldering embers. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but something felt off. I walked around the campsite, searching for tracks or any sign of what I'd seen. Near the edge of the clearing, I found them, hoof prints but elongated, almost like they had been stretched unnaturally. They didn't belong to any deer I'd ever seen. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling. As I threw the last of my gear into the car, I glanced back at the forest. It was quiet, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Driving away, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it had been a sick animal or my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That night, I researched skinwalkers, folklore, anything that might explain what I saw. Most of the stories seemed too far-fetched, too rooted in legend. But then I read about creatures that mimic human speech, that wear the guise of animals but aren't animals at all. I don't know what was out there that night, but I've never gone camping alone since. And every so often, when I'm alone in the dark, I think I hear that same raspy breathing, that same unnatural whine, just faint enough to make me wonder if it's real. I've always enjoyed the idea of being alone in the middle of nowhere, just me and nature. In 2016, I rented a remote cabin in the woods of northern Maine for a long weekend. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged in an old postcard. A single-story log cabin with a porch that faced a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town. The cabin was built in the 1950s, and while it had running water and electricity, it still felt isolated, which was exactly what I was looking for. I just turned 34, and life had been exhausting. My job was stressful, my social life was non-existent, and I felt like I was losing my grip on everything. A solo trip into the wilderness sounded perfect. No phone calls, no emails, no responsibilities. I packed a few essentials: canned food, a camping stove, a hunting knife, and a couple of books. I left my phone behind on purpose. The drive up was uneventful, and I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The place was tucked deep into the woods, with a narrow gravel road leading to it. The nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles away, and the silence was deafening. The cabin smelled of pine and old wood. It had a single bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room with a fireplace. The windows were small and dusty, and the only light came from a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. It wasn't luxurious, but it was cozy enough. I spent the first evening unpacking and exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick and seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and no sounds of human activity. Just me and the trees. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the fireplace, read a book, and fell asleep on the couch. I don't remember hearing a single sound all night, which was a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. The second day. The next morning, I decided to take a hike. I'd brought a map of the area, but the trails weren't well marked, so I made mental notes of landmarks as I went. There was an old wooden bridge over a creek about half a mile from the cabin, and a large boulder shaped like a bear further down the trail. As I walked deeper into the woods, I started to notice how quiet it was. Too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no rustling of leaves, nothing. It felt unnatural, but I told myself it was just my imagination. After about 2 hours of hiking, I decided to turn back. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. I cooked a simple dinner on the camping stove and ate on the porch, watching the forest grow darker. That's when I noticed something. A figure, maybe 100 yards away, standing just inside the tree line. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the figure didn't move. It was too far away to see clearly, but it looked like a woman, dressed in what appeared to be an old, tattered dress. I stared for a while, trying to make sense of it. My rational mind told me it was probably just a hiker or a shadow cast by the trees, but my gut told me something was wrong. I stood up and called out, but there was no response. When I turned to grab my flashlight from inside, the figure was gone. The night, That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound seemed louder than it should have been. The creaking of the wooden floor, the wind outside, the occasional snap of a twig. I kept telling myself it was just the forest being the forest, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind or the creak of the porch. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the cabin. I froze, my heart pounding. The hunting knife was on the coffee table, just out of reach. I sat there, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled the cabin. They stopped near the front door. I wanted to get up, grab the knife, and check the door, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of stone. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't open, but it rattled, like someone was trying to force it. I finally snapped out of my paralysis, grabbed the knife, and crept toward the door. The knob stopped rattling before I got there, and when I opened the door, there was no one there. I stepped onto the porch, shining my flashlight into the woods. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything unusual, just trees and shadows. Still, I felt like I was being watched. The following day, I spent the next day on edge. I didn't go hiking, didn't leave the cabin at all. I locked the doors and windows and kept the knife close. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the woods. A flicker of a shadow, the rustling of bushes, but I couldn't be sure. As the sun began to set, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things, ready to leave first thing in the morning. The last night that night was worse than the one before. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of tapping on the bedroom window. It wasn't a branch or an animal, it was rhythmic, deliberate.
Top, top, top.
I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. She was there, the same woman from before, standing just a foot away from the window. Her face was pale, her eyes dark, and her expression was blank. She didn't move, didn't blink. I stumbled back, my heart racing. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, she was gone. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed awake, gripping the knife, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, I grabbed my things and left without looking back. The aftermath. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone else being there. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. Whatever I saw or thought I saw felt too real to ignore. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that I wasn't alone out there, and I never want to be again. I rented a cabin deep in the woods for a week-long getaway. It was the kind of isolation I craved after months of city chaos. No emails, no traffic, no endless noise. Just me, nature, and silence. The cabin was in northern Montana, surrounded by miles of forest, with a small lake about a 5-minute walk away. It was late October 2022, and the trees had already shed most of their leaves, leaving the ground blanketed in brown and orange. The place was old but sturdy. The wood smelled of pine and age, and the furniture was basic but comfortable. There was a wood stove, a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a creaky porch that overlooked the dense trees. A dirt road led up to the cabin, but it wasn't visible from where I stood. It felt like I was the last person on Earth, a welcome thought at the time. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking through the woods, reading, and sitting by the lake. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. At night, the darkness was impenetrable, save for the glow of the full moon and the faint orange flicker of my fire. On the third night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to stir me from sleep. A crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves, came from outside. I lay still, listening. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breathing slowed as I strained my ears. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound didn't return, and I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They were faint but clearly human. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They led from the edge of the woods to the cabin and stopped near the porch. There were no returning prints, which meant whoever had been there didn't leave the way they came, or they were still around. I felt a wave of unease. This wasn't exactly a popular area, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Maybe a lost hiker, I thought, or someone looking for help. But I hadn't heard anyone calling out, and the prints didn't look recent. I spent the day trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was overthinking it. I even hiked to the lake again, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But the unease lingered, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. That night, I locked the door and windows before going to bed. I kept the fire going longer than usual, the flickering light giving me some comfort. Sleep didn't come easily, but exhaustion eventually won. I woke up to another noise, this time louder. It was a thud, like something heavy hitting the porch. My eyes shot open, and I sat up in bed, heart racing. The sound came again, followed by a slow creak, as if someone was stepping onto the wooden boards. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and crept to the window. The cabin was pitch dark except for the moonlight filtering through the trees. I hesitated before pulling back the curtain, half dreading what I might see. Nothing. The porch was empty, but as I scanned the tree line, something caught my eye, a figure. A man, standing just at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just staring in my direction. I froze, my mind racing. What was he doing out there? Was he the one who had left the footprints? Why wasn't he moving? I stayed by the window for what felt like hours, watching him. He didn't move an inch. Eventually, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I went back to bed, though I didn't sleep much. By morning, the man was gone. I spent the day inside, too scared to venture out. I kept checking the windows, half expecting him to appear again. When the sun began to set, I piled more wood onto the fire and kept the flashlight close. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time, it was a soft tapping like fingers on glass. I turned toward the window, and my stomach dropped. The man was standing right there, his face nearly pressed against the glass. I bolted upright, grabbing the flashlight and shining it directly at him. He didn't flinch. His face was pale, his eyes unblinking. He just stood there, staring. I grabbed the heavy fire poker and stood my ground, my hand trembling. After what felt like forever, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up my things. I didn't care that I still had days left on the rental. I just wanted to get out of there. But when I stepped outside, my heart sank. My car's tires were slashed, all 4 of them. Panicked. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I considered hiking back to the main road, but the thought of leaving the cabin made my skin crawl. What if he was still out there? I spent the day barricading the doors and windows. I found an old hunting knife in one of the drawers and kept it close. As night fell, I felt trapped, like a caged animal. The noises started earlier this time. Footsteps circling the cabin, a faint scratching on the walls. Then came the tapping on the windows, louder and more insistent. I sat in the corner of the room, clutching the knife, my heart pounding in my chest. The noises stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the door handle rattled. I held my breath as the door creaked open, the barricade holding for now. But I knew it wouldn't last. The man stepped inside, his pale face illuminated by the firelight. He looked at me, his lips curling into a smile. That was the last thing I remembered before everything went dark. When I woke up, the sun was rising and the man was gone. My car was untouched, and there were no footprints, no signs he had ever been there. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the way he looked at me. I left that cabin and never went back. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still see him standing in the shadows, watching.